Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Fantasy Friday. So, last week we ended up reading two chapters since they were a little bit short, and I think we'll do the same again this week. We have chapters 5 and 6 coming up in The Tiger and the Wolf by Adrian Tchaikovsky. So, let's see what happens. Chapter number 5. Asmander was awakened by the sounds of fighting. He and the horse delegation had been gifted one of the smaller huts to curl up in, presumably leaving some of the more wretched laughing men to shiver outside in the dark. With so many sleepers laid out close together around the circle of the floor, like interlocking pieces of a puzzle, the cold of nightfall did not touch them. And, besides, Asmander had a gift for sleeping well, yet waking when he needed to. He was on his feet in an instant. Some of the horse were already about, judging from the vacant spaces on the floor, and there was no sign of Venater at all. No surprise there. From the sound of it, Venater was one of those doing the fighting. The pirate had been awake still when Asmander retired, conversing in guarded, hostile tones with the Malika of the Laughing Men. Asmander was only surprised it had taken the man so long to get into trouble. In nothing but a loincloth, his stone-toothed Macan sword in hand, Asmander hurried up into the morning light. There were three of them pitched against Venator. 3 men, though, and it was plain that amongst this tribe the men were given no place of honor or respect. Nonetheless, they were game fighters, from what Asmander could now see, teaming up to try and bring the big southerner down. It was all in friendly contest, that much he saw. When they were in human form, their hands were empty of weapons. Still, the Laughing Men possessed jaws that could grind bones, and fights like these were seldom won or lost without blood being drawn. Seeing that there was no real danger to Venator, and that the Laughing Men had not decided to butcher their guests, Asmander just stood back and watched his companion fight. He moved like strong waters, this old pirate, deceptive when he was still, unstoppable once he struck. Sometimes he wore his human shape, with sallow skin gleaming in the bright sunlight. More often he was stepped into the true form of his soul, the savage creature he called the dragon. Long and black he was, as heavy and powerful as when he walked on 2 legs, and his scales were like black pebbles. His blunt head gaped wide in threat, showing a horrific array of curving fangs, and he could rush with a terrible swiftness, even on those sprawling, ungainly-looking legs. The 3 Laughing Men tried to surround him, to nip at him from behind while he chased whoever was before him, but Venator was an old warrior, wise to such tricks. More than that, there was no part of him that was easy to attack. Asmander winced as one would-be ambusher was lashed across the muzzle by the sharp whip of Venator's tail, while one of the others got too close and was hooked about the foreleg by the monstrous lizard's claws. Instantly Venator was a man again, lifting the startled hyena up and flipping the animal over his shoulder. The Laughing Man stepped in midair and managed a creditable landing on hands and knees, whereupon Venator kicked him in the stomach and sent him rolling away. The third hyena leapt for him, aiming to connect with his chest, but Venator had stepped again, dropping down to his lizard shape so that his enemy sailed overhead. With calculated indolence, Venator turned to face them, blue-black tongue lashing at the air. Then he was a man once more, trying to lure them closer, and Asmander met the stone force of his gaze, recognizing the challenge there and waving it aside. Another time, perhaps. Seeing him there, Asmander was swept up in the memory of when he had first set eyes on the pirate, remembering when the two of them had fought. Back then, Asmander's father had taken a war band of the clan's warriors out with the specific intention of ridding the Sotek estuary of its most troublesome pirate. The dragon were ever troublesome vassals of the Sun River Nation, and more than one had turned outlaw and raider in the past. Venator had been the boldest in living memory, striking even within sight of the prince's own palace at Sokawan. The warband had tracked the pirate Venat, as he was known when his name was still his own, to one of the innumerable estuary islands. There they approached under cover of the murky water, stepped into the long, ridge-backed shapes of crocodiles. There were 2 score of them, and the pirates were less than a dozen, and mostly drunk. The fight as a whole was no great victory to carve on the walls of the mighty, but Venat. Asmander remembered him leaping up, roaring his defiance, the stone blade of his maret cleaving spears in two and splitting shields. He had been as drunk as the rest, but that had not stopped or even slowed him. And Asmander, who had newly found his role as champion of the River Lords, knew that the moment had come to test the shape of his soul against this foe. He had stepped into that fleeter form, the obsidian of his macan becoming his teeth, the jade of his spurs, his claws, and he had rushed from the midst of his father's warriors to do battle. They had wanted to stop him, but he was a champion. They dared not lay hands on him, not even Asman, his father. And the fight. So fierce a contest! Venat had struck at him with his bone-breaking tail, and claws strong enough to tear open bronze. He had snapped his teeth against the scaly quills of Asmander's hide, which were reinforced with the cotton and stone of the armor he wore. A shallow bite would have been debilitating, a deep one fatal, for the dragons of the estuary were venomous as well as merely savage. Legend said that dark spirits of the early world had created them to be as inimical to all other beasts as it was possible to be. Asmander had let speed become his ally, leaping to drive his claws into the great lizard's back, always a step aside, a step ahead. He had known exactly the risks he ran, and he ran them gladly. He had never lived as when he had lived next to the death that dwelled in Venet's jaws. And at last the man was beaten, sprawled bleeding and cursing, shifting from writhing lizard back to man, and eventually just staring up at Asmander with hate-filled eyes, expecting nothing but death. And death was what he deserved. No noble robber of the stories, he, but a villain, a murderer, a rebel against prince and nation. Asmander had placed one clawed foot on his defeated enemy's neck and waited for his father's command. It had not come, and for a moment he had thought, he remembered this clearly, is he dead? Am I Asman now? Along with all the little attendant thoughts that whirled and spun in the wake of that huge one. But then he had cocked his head, while keeping one eye on his prize, and seen his father standing amongst his men, staring at his son with such an expression. Pride, yes, but there had been depths to that expression, as clouded as the river. Anger that Asmander had so risked himself, calculation at how this proven asset that was his son might now best be used, and envy. Asmander remembered that plainly. The envy never left his father's face, from that moment on, that his son should be so honored by the gods as to be a champion, whilst he grew older and no stronger, and some day this boy before him would bear his name. But Asman was a man of politics above all. He had lived his life navigating the hazardous waters of the Sun River Nation's powers and factions. Not for nothing were his people known also as the Patient Ones. What then? He had asked his son. Will you stay your hand? In his champion's shape, the youth could not answer, but he bobbed his head once, indicating his submission to his father's will. Notorious pirate, Asman declared. You are defeated, your followers slain. Around them, their corpses stood as mute witness, some stabbed with jagged spears, others ripped by long jaws. A couple of the victorious attackers had retained their crocodile forms, coasting silently through waters now red and salty with blood. Venat had glowered murder upon him, but Asmander's talons were tight and sharp about his neck, holding him to his human form, a great sickle claw poised ready to descend on his face. You will be bound and noosed, Asmander declared. You will be brought before Tecumander, heir to the daybreak throne. There you will die in the pool of the crocodile, ripped into pieces by our mute brothers. The pirate's mouth twitched, as though he wanted to spit, but was too wary of that hovering claw. Or, as you are a man of skill and courage, however misused, you may suffer yourself to be stripped of all you are. Yes, even your name.
and sworn to the service of my clan, to earn back your honor, until such time as you can once again call yourself a man. Think on that choice as we carry you back to Sokawan."
"I'd rather die,"
Venat had finally got out.
but he had not. Despite his defiance, when they had stood him before old Crocodile's pool, he had bowed the knee and relinquished his name. Even then, he had stared at Asmander with a blood-red promise of revenge. The look he gave the youth now, these few years later, during which everything within the Sun River Nation had changed, was its close cousin. Asmander was glad. It was a melancholy truth, but he had always been more at ease with hatred than with love. He knew where he was with antagonism, with challenge, with people who would rip out his throat if he bared it to them. He liked the Laughing Men on first sight for just that simple, honest quality. It was people who smiled and simpered and flattered him that meant him the more harm, he knew well. Some day, he reflected, as Venator returned to his fighting.
"Have them wash their wounds well after," he advised the spectators. "He has filthy teeth."
Later, he came upon Venator as the man washed.
"Finished with your playing?"
he asked. The pirate gave him a sour look.
"Traveling with the horse is piss dull. I like these people. They live well."
Asmander smiled a little, hearing his own thoughts mirrored.
"They cut you a little, I see."
Venator's bared chest and back bore a scattering of fresh scratches, a few of which still bled. For a precious moment he looked almost shifty, but then he laughed.
"Not them. It'd take more than those dogs."
"Then,"
Asmander reassessed the damage. Trophies of a different sort of combat.
"you lay with the Malika?"
"Only because you were too scared of her."
"Not my type,"
said Asmander, and then he grinned, shaking his head.
"Where did that come from?"
"She appreciates a strong man. They don't seem to have any around here."
"And you?"
Venator shrugged, then winced ruefully.
"These things are known. Beware a woman as strong as you are. I never ended a night with so many bruises. Are the horse finally finished talking?"
Asmander had seen the society delegation gathering, and he shrugged.
"Something's happening, anyway."
The pirate growled.
"I never thought I'd find a people who talk more than you riverlords do. We should just take one of those boats and go."
"And then you'd paddle? Or would that just be me pressing on the oar upstream, all the way to the crown of the world?"
Asmander asked him wryly.
"No, they know the back of the Sotek, and we do not. And they will sell us fit clothing for the cold once we are there. All lives interweave, as the snakes tell us."
Venator spat to show exactly what he thought of that, but, soon afterwards, Eschmir the horse hetman was approaching.
"We've exhausted the hospitality of the Laughing Men?"
Asmander suggested brightly.
"No more chuckles. They want us gone?"
Her expression was awkward. Something of the opposite. Seeing the tense anticipation that descended on him, she was quick to add, "Not trouble, but they have invited you on a hunt."
"Me?"
"Others as well, but the Malika very much wishes for you to run with her hunters."
"She wants to see the champion," Asmander divined.
I'm sorry," she confirmed.
"Why?"
"You do not seem to wish to show it. Since leaving Atalan, you have not stepped." Her face was a study in concentration as she tried to navigate the hidden reefs of Sun River custom.
"It is not fair play," he told her. "Most certainly it is not to impress. The champion of the river people is a shape not lightly taken. But for a hunt? Yes, a hunt is serious business. It is fitting."
Her relief was palpable. I was not sure."
"We are complex people in the nation, and we care about many things," Asmander said softly. "But the champion knows what is important in life. And sometimes that makes living with the cares of people difficult, especially the patient ones."
The Laughing Men hunted many types of prey, singly and in packs, but the great prize of the plains was the wild aurochs. They had been tracking a solitary bull for days before the hunt, an old beast without a herd, yet strong and aggressive enough to warn off even lions. Now it stood in the chest-high grass, brooding and chewing, lifting its great head at every flight of birds or change in the wind. Looking on it, Asmander had the sense that the beast knew well what was to come, and welcomed it. The soul in that hulk of a body wished to move on with honor, and preferably with some blood upon its horns. Venator did not care for the hunt, but the possibility of Asmander making a fool of himself was eternally attractive, and so he had come, with the hetman and a handful of the horse society, just to watch. A good score of the Laughing Men were there too, half a dozen of whom would hunt alongside the southerner. These were the young and the strong, 4 women and 2 men, their skin fresh painted with streaks of white and gold.
How do I look?
Asmander asked, grinning. He had the same adornment, the colors particularly striking against his darker skin.
Like a badly decorated pot, the pirate replied. All you need is a little red, but that's what those horns are for.
The Malika sent a stern glance towards him, and, to Asmander's astonishment, Venator fell silent. The entire venture was almost worth it just for that.
There was a tribe once.
The ruler of the Laughing Men drifted closer, her eyes fixed on their wary quarry.
They were the people of the aurochs, and they were strong and fierce in battle. What happened to them?
Asmander asked, as was obviously required.
They betrayed their own souls. They took their mute brothers and penned them, and kept them for their meat, and so they grew weak, and we fell upon them and destroyed them. But now we have cattle, and so do all the peoples. All of life is profiting from the misfortunes of others.
She grinned, feral and fierce.
In your hunt, champion, know that the souls of the aurochs live still, forever reborn into these mute bodies, forever knowing that they once had language and understanding. Know that, by shedding this old one's blood, you move him one step further in on his journey. Perhaps one day he will be born as a man again, when his soul knows that he has atoned for the mistakes of his people.
Asmander nodded, eyes fixed on the great beast in the middle distance. Did he feel a shock of contact, meeting that far gaze?
My hunters will drive him and channel him, but the honor of the kill is yours, if you can take it.
The Malika was watching him intently. Asmander rolled his shoulders. He was here bare-chested and without armor. Stone mail would not save him against the sweep of those horns, only speed of action. There was no signal, but abruptly the Laughing Men hunters had all stepped and were racing off into the grass, where their progress was visible as a rushing tremor cutting a curving path that would overshoot the bull, then draw back to herd the beast towards Asmander. The spectators were slowly falling away, abandoning him to his skills. He looked back once, meeting Venator's gaze. The pirate's expression said eloquently,
Well, look what you've got yourself into.
His macan was a comforting weight dangling from his wrist strap. He saw the bull's head coming up, scenting the approach of the hyena pack, and yet one dark eye was fixed on him alone.
Old crocodile, fill me with your peace. Let me wait in the calm of your waters. Let my strike be sudden.
Asmander murmured to himself, because soon words would be denied him. The high, yipping cackle of the hunters carried to him over the grass. Abruptly the bull was in motion, just an amble at first, shaking his head in irritation, but then the pack must have appeared from another quarter, warding the beast away from his escape, and abruptly he was gathering speed.
Serpent, you who pass below all, Asmander said, now hurrying the words a little, guide my prey's soul swift to its new birth, or my soul, or mine.
Then there was no more time for prayer, and he stepped. The Malika and some of her people had stayed close enough to witness this moment, but he was oblivious to their reaction as his human form lunged forwards into that of the champion of the river people. As he had said, it was not done for show. He was no larger than human in that form, and lower slung, his body canted forwards and balanced by the long, stiff spine of his tail. His hide was something like scales, but longer, more delicate, and if he shook himself just so, they would rattle like a snake's tail, like the coursing of the rain. He stepped forwards on 2 feet, each with its killing claw held delicately off the ground to keep it sharp. His hands, and they were still hands, just, were also barbed weapons, as was the deep bite of his jaws. There was something of the crocodile to him, and something of Venator's dragon lizard, but mostly he was himself, an impossible animal. No man had ever hunted one such as he. His was a shape that existed only as a thought in the mind of the world, a memory of the great spirits for whom the span of all human years was an eye blink, and irrelevant. The bull was coming on fast now, with the pack nipping at its heels, infuriating it. Asmander stalked forwards with all of old Crocodile's patience, with the serpent's steady gaze. Inside, he felt as though he was only partly in control. The champion was a second soul in him, passing through his life for the brief spans that he called upon it. No man could truly hope to own these killing limbs, this speed, this strength. The dreadful anticipation that rose within him was that of the champion, and to Asmander it was like a drug, a joy, a truth. The champion saw the world so much more clearly than that. Each time he took his form, he did not want to let it go. The bull saw him, that sleek reptile shape knifing through the grass, and turned its path away, tossing its head at a hyena unwise enough to get too close, and sending the hunter yelping away. The aurochs was fast, moving at the limits of the pack's ability to hurt it, but Asmander was faster, and he could leap. There was nothing else in the world that could leap as he could. 3 long steps towards the aurochs' turning flank, and then he sprang, sailing clear above the grass to tear into the animal's hide, hanging there with 4 sets of claws before ripping a long, shallow gash down the bull's ribs and kicking himself away. He landed in a crouch, and the bull turned on him, in fury, in recognition, its horns lowered. Asmander faced it down, head thrust forwards and jaws agape, screeching out his challenge. For the length of a drawn breath, the world stood still, the aurochs and Asmander, whilst the laughing men looked on in wonder. Then the bull charged without warning, its colossal weight and strength in furious motion, horns like lances in the ground shaking under its approach. Asmander felt a thrill of anticipation, never fear, for the champion did not know it. And then he was skipping aside, leaving that sinuous motion to the last possible moment, and another leap carried him to the bull's hindquarters, where he tore another patchwork of bloody lines. Still he did not bite. To bite was to commit, to fix himself in place to a quarry that could still very easily kill him. He jumped off again, and this time the aurochs lumbered onwards, following the line of its charge until the laughing men materialized out of the grass to head it off. When it turned, it was warier than before, its dark hide painted with blood. It met Asmander's yellow gaze. "Once more, my friend." This was why Asmander had valued the rage and hate of Venator more than the words of his own clan or his prince's court. This was the kind of honesty that he sought in a crooked world. The bull wanted to kill him. The bull wanted to live. Asmander valued its hostile regard more than gold. With the hideous cacophony of the laughing men at its back, it stamped and scuffed at the ground beneath it, and then it came for him, without hope, but with honor. And how many men could say as much in their last moments? This time Asmander almost left it too late, seduced by the sheer power and beauty of the behemoth bearing down on him. The champion knew its place, though, and swung him to the bull's forequarters, one sickle claw dug into its throat, one hooked behind its shoulders. And, as the bull bucked and plunged to dislodge him, he brought his jaws down upon the back of the great neck with all their strength, shearing through the dense thickness of muscle and severing the chain of bone along which ran the auroch's life. When they reached him, the spectators, the Malika, Venater. They found him in his human shape again, with the other hunters keeping a respectful distance. He was sitting by the huge mound of the bull's body, one hand on its bloodied side, feeling as though he had lost a friend. So, that's what happened to Venator and Asmander during the time where Maniye was doing other stuff back with the wolves. And that's the conclusion of chapter 5. So now we start chapter 6, and we're going back to Maniye's tribe, the Winter Runners. So let's see what she's up to. Chapter number 6. Compared to the evening cold without, the air inside the chief's hut practically sweated with heat from the central fire, smoky enough to sting Maniye's eyes. Tonight the tribe was fasting. She could hear distant yelps and howls as packs of the young, the recently tested and their siblings and relatives, ran wild between the mounds, chasing after each other in mock hunts, engaging in brief, snarling fights. She had no wish to rejoin them, to inevitably become the hunted and to be reminded of her lot. Just for once, she had wanted to sit all alone and know that she had passed, that she had succeeded in this thing that had been looming over her for so long. She had scaled the wall. And now, Akrit, her father, had sent for her. He was seated facing away from her, staring at the fire. Stripped to the waist, there were no war scars on his back, for he was a man who faced his enemies whenever he fought them. Instead, she saw the set of savage, puckered marks left by some ordeal or initiation, a double row of livid blemishes flanking his spine. Kalameshli sat nearby, watching her closely. Otherwise the hall was empty. Even the thralls had been sent away. At last Akrit turned. There were several gourds strewn nearby, the air ripe with the scents of honey and fermented yams, and she realized that he was drunk, or at least a little. Normally that would have her fearing his fists even more than usual, but tonight he was drunk in some new way, some way that made him happy rather than fierce and angry. He regarded her uncertainly, as though he had never seen her before. And he hasn't, in a way. I am a new creature now. For once she felt she could meet his gaze without fear. She had something to hold her head up for.
Kalameshli wasn't sure that you would pass,
Her father said to her thoughtfully. Kalameshli would have been delighted had I failed, was her instant thought, but she kept it to herself.
I knew, though, Akrit went on. You're my blood, after all. Of course you've mastered yourself. You're Stone River's child. It could be no other way.
The unfairness of that, as though he was taking the credit for all she had done, stung her a little, but his next words wiped that resentment away.
It's good. It's as it should be. It's good.
Praise, of a sort? And he had not exactly been forthcoming with such in the past, nor had anyone else. And his expression, as he looked on her, was something warmer than the doubt or annoyance she was used to seeing.
You're of the wolf now,
he told her. It was little enough, giving her what she had already earned, and yet, all of a sudden, 14 years of bottled emotion began rising up in her. She fought them back desperately, a battle as hard as climbing the wall had been, because she would not appear weak before them. She was wolf, and the wolf was fire and winter, and did not know tears.
When the year turns, it's time, her father continued, more to Kalameshli than herself.
The old priest nodded.
I suppose it is. A purpose has been laid for you since before you were born.
Now Akrit's eyes were back on Maniye.
Everything was waiting on today. I had to know for sure you were mine, not...
The thought went unfinished, but she read it in his face. Not my mother's, not the tiger's. She felt the great cat stir again within her at that, but it felt very far away and buried deep. She was losing it. She was wolf now. That was what was proper, what she had wanted, wasn't it? Suddenly she fitted in. She had a place amongst the winter runners, within the jaws of the wolf. And, if one must live so, How much better to be the teeth that tore rather than the flesh that ripped into. Will I be a hunter? She wondered. Will I be a raider? What will you make of me? It was as though a hanging had been drawn aside, and she could look into a different world, the world she had never realized would be opened to her. I am the wolf. I am the voice that calls in the night. I am that which hunts in a pack. Akrit sat, dropping straight down into a cross-legged position, with a small grunt of effort, and gestured for her to do likewise, as one adult to another, a chief to one of his tribe.
Before you were born, we went to war, he remarked. You know this? Even you. Back then, the tiger was strong, and we all lived in his shadow. But the wolf gave us iron claws and iron coats, and the boar and the deer rose with us, even the bear and the Erie-men a little. And we broke the shadow eaters. We drove the people of the tiger into the highlands. You have heard these stories of these things.
I have heard them. Her voice even sounded different, not a girl's anymore, and yet more of her father's daughter than before.
You know that your mother was of their tribe.
There was a hard edge to his tone, but when she answered, I know it, without any hurt in her voice, that seemed to satisfy him.
She was trouble, an evil woman. The tiger are ruled by their women. You know this?
I have heard it spoken. She was waiting for some stab of anguish to engulf her over her mother, but she was wolf, and she was calm. I have no mother, she could tell herself. I have no tiger within me.
They called her the Tiger Queen when she was still free, before I took her, Akrit explained. Even with a rope about her neck. Too much trouble.
He gestured vaguely, shaking his head.
But we were hoping this day would come, when a child of hers would come of age, and be of the wolf. And here you are.
A slow uncertainty was stealing over Maniye. The last thing she had expected was so much talk of her mother. She had stood before Akrit, feeling that half of her cut away, and now he was fumblingly trying to join it back onto her. I am of the wolf, she said carefully. Akrit nodded animatedly, and in that rapid motion she saw just how drunk he really was.
But you are her daughter.
I am your daughter. It was not something she had ever wanted to be before, but suddenly it was very important to her.
But you are hers. That is how they do things among the Shadow Eaters. The mother rules, and then the daughter.
Akrit grinned abruptly.
So, it is time we bare our teeth again. This spring, the winter runners shall go to raid the highlands and draw the tiger out. And when we have their attention, when we have bloodied them a little and reminded them of the strength of the wolf, we shall show you to them, the child of their queen.
She was just watching now, saying nothing.
And they will kneel, because you are their dead queen's get. And you will bring them under the wolf's shadow. You will bring them under my shadow, and they will league with the winter runners, and we will be the strongest of the wolf's children. Eh, Calameshly takes iron?
She felt as though she was tracking something through the forest, print by print, scent by scent, and now she stood before its lair, understanding what it was she had been hunting. She wondered how much of this might have been couched differently had he been sober. Akrit's words for her were normally few and hostile, but her passing her test, her denying the tiger within her, had been for him the culmination of many years of scheming. Apparently, he felt that he was allowed to relax his guard just this much. There was a high chief of the wolf, the first and only chief of chiefs. 7 skins of the Many Mouths tribe held that honor, made such by the acclaim of his peers during the war with the tiger. He had masterminded the uprising of the wolf, when her father had been just one war leader amongst many, albeit one who had taken more risks and won more victories than most. 7 Skins was old, though, years past Calameshly's age. The time would come when he would pass into the forest, and if there was to be another high chief, who knew who that might be? If Akrit could make the hated Shadow Eaters bow the knee, then none would deny him. This was the purpose he had contrived for her. It was a grand plan, and one that might have failed at so many points, but Akrit and Kalameshli and the will of the wolf had made it work. Here she now was, poised to stand before her mother's people and lead them into the wolf's shadow. She reached within herself to see what she thought of this. She had never realized that the tiger were so bound to their bloodlines that some bastard child of their last ruler might come and usurp control of their whole tribe. For all she knew, Akrit was entirely wrong about that. They might just tear her apart. Or she might bring him a grand victory for the wolf. She might prove herself Akrit's daughter. She had never thought that being of use was something she might aspire to. She had spent her childhood being as contrary as possible, as a reaction to finding herself without friends or place or even parents who cared about her. The harsh hand of Kalameshli had seemed almost more paternal than that of Akrit, and yet all that time she had been in his thoughts, if not as his child, then at least as his weapon. If he had asked for her agreement, she might have said yes, and been forever after bound by her own word. He took her consent, her subjugation to his plan and his will, as a given, though. He never asked, and so never extracted that agreement from her. And then he added,
And we must find you a mate, of course.
She went still at the thought.
If the Shadow Eaters are to be driven into the wolf's shadow, they will need a firm hand holding the switch, he went on,
And the image made her think of Kalameshli, so that, for a terrible moment, she thought that the old priest was somehow being put forward as a suitor, against his vows and all prior custom. I will rule them for you, she said, but Akrit barely seemed to hear her.
You will need a man, a hunter, to govern you, he told her, even if the Shadow Eaters will want to hear his words in your voice.
He frowned.
Someone who will do what he's told.
Something inside her was turning sour, as though she had been drinking and the liquor was curdling in her stomach. Yes, so many of her peers had lived a life of speculation over who they might be mated to, recounting the names of the fine young hunters or hearth keepers of the wolf tribes. For Maniye, however, it had never been a consideration. She had made a virtue of necessity. She had lived a future in her mind in which she was self-sufficient, a tribe of one.
I would match you to Smiles without teeth, Akrit went on, forging deeper and deeper into this appalling new territory and dragging her along with him. I would want him always at my side, though. And he is not the cleverest.
Maniye had begun to shake, very slightly. She thought of big, brutal Smiles without teeth, a man without humor or imagination, but very quick to strike out whenever the complex world frustrated him. He had already taken one wife, Maniye recalled, but the woman had been seen too often with bruises about her face, and she had cast him from her hearth. Smiles had been searching for a new wife ever since, but no woman would look at him. But her father continued talking, the drink drawing the words out of him, and Kalameshli listened complacently. Nothing of the conversation even required her contribution or consent.
But then I thought, Akrit went on, there was one I need by my side for the fight, and nothing I've done for the ungrateful cur has ever bound him to me enough to keep him here whenever spring comes. But if I give you to Broken Axe, then that must be enough. He must know his wandering days are done and become my warrior.
Maniye sat motionless, because she knew this game. This was the game she herself had played every day up to today, up to the testing. This was the game she had thought she would never need to play again. This was show nothing on your face. This was where she sat and pretended that nothing that she heard or saw affected her, because if the world knew that it could hurt you, then hurt you it would. Matched to the man who killed my mother, and it was obvious that her father saw nothing objectionable in this thought at all. All at once she had made up her mind and knew what she must do. What good are you? The moon was overcast tonight, so the darkness of the pit was near total. She stared challengingly at the pale smudge that was the snake priest, Hespric essen skis.
Tell me,
She hissed, feeling inexplicably furious at him, just for his being there, as though he was to blame for her predicament.
what's the use of you? What's a snake priest for?
I know many things, he said carefully.
What things? Priest things? Magic?
Sure, magic, yes.
You have friends here in the crown of the world? Friends who will help you?
He was silent. That meant no.
These things you know, they're valuable? Or can you make people do what you want? Or
Her words tailed away to nothing. He was bound, haltered, kept in a pit. If his knowledge gave him genuine power, would any of those things be true?
what good are you?
She repeated. She heard him take a deep breath, and then he spoke as clearly as he could, fighting to speak around his raw gums.
The wise of the north might value what I know. Those who lushed for blood less than do the wolf. The horse people will honor me, and I can live in many lands.
You're no hunter.
You need no hunter to trap or to fish.
His patient, quiet tone was maddening.
You'll die!
She spat at him, striving to keep her voice low despite her desperation.
If my father hadn't taken you, you'd be a frozen body out in the woods, or prey for our mute brothers.
And yet I crossed half the world to get here.
She thought hard. She felt as though there must be some magic combination of words that would somehow cut the whole knot of her problem open and present her with a simple and certain way out. Instead, she had herself, and she had this ragged, wretched creature. She was leaving, she had decided. She was abandoning the tribe. It wasn't unknown. Broken Axe had done it, become a lone wolf and made his mark on the world. Much as she did not want to think about him, perhaps in this he would be her inspiration. Of course, Broken Axe, or the youth he had once been, was not wanted by the chief for some mad plan to conquer the tiger.
What troubles you, girl?
Asked Hespric Essenski softly. She glared at him. She would give him no blades to hold to her throat, nor secrets to cut her with. She had crouched in her alcove under the roof of the chief's hall, and counted over her options, forced herself to examine precisely why she was going to cut herself loose from her own people. The bitterness of it was that she had finally been given something to stay for, after all. She had passed the testing. She had proved herself a wolf. If he had only left her alone after that, she would have been Akrit's most loyal supporter. She could have taught herself to love him, despite all, even to love Kalameshli, because he was the voice of the wolf, her wolf. But that was not what Akrit had wanted from her. He did not want her at all, not Maniye. He wanted a tame shadow eater cub with a tiger muzzled within her, so as to twist her mother's people into paying him tribute and strengthening his name. That was all she was, a thing to be used. And to keep her on a leash, he would marry her to Broken Axe. That ought to be the worst of it. But, in truth, it was that sense of being used, as a thing is used, that cut deepest. And even if the old snake died in the cold, in the snow, in the woods, still she would be striking one grand blow against her father and against Kalameshli. Not only would she be taking herself out of their grasp, she would be robbing the wolf of his sacrifice. The thought made her breathless with fear and daring. If the wolf would not accept her as herself, then she would not hesitate to steal from his hearth. She would turn her back on him. Perhaps she would choose the tiger in her once she could. Perhaps she would choose the tiger in her, once she could put off that choice no longer. The thought hurt her. Making that choice between the two souls within her was like seizing briars. She knew she would eventually have to, lest her soul split in two and drive her mad, but she put the thought off one more time.
You said the horse. You came from the south with the horse society? She told the snake.
I did.
Still so polite and conversational, though she could hear him shivering. Would they take you south again?
When I am done in the north.
Done what? Done being sacrificed? She goaded him.
If the wolf will not speak to me, there is still the deer, the eyrie, the bear, the tiger. Somewhere I will find wisdom in this cold land.
She was about to demand that, as the price for his life, he take her south immediately, but when his words sunk in, and she thought, the tiger? Will they receive you? She asked. Or will they kill you? How do you know you won't be met like this wherever you go? We have no kind tales about the serpent.
I don't know.
He let out a long sigh.
I have to hope. It's very important.
And she found she was decided, just like that. She had a flint blade in her hand and was stepping forwards, feeling him flinch. If I cut loose your collar, can you step? Can you climb?
Better than a tiger.
His voice, so close to her, made her shiver. You must travel with me. I know these lands. A gross exaggeration from a girl who, a moment before, had despaired of finding any use for this wreck of an old man. Now, though, he was all she had. She needed to keep him with her.
Agreed.
She had her hands at his throat, the razor sharpness of the flint against his skin. She could have killed him then and there, another way of stealing him from Kalameshli. She seized the rope they had haltered him with, the noose that held him to his human shape, and sawed at it, tugging him back and forth until the tough fibers parted and abruptly he was free. Instantly she jumped backwards, stepping so that she could see him with her tiger's eyes. For a moment he was just the same stiff old man, hands tied to a stake driven into the earth floor. Then, with the impression of immense relief and release, he stepped. It was a fluid, elegant motion, one that ceded nothing of his age and stiffened joints. In an instant he had no arms nor hands, and the ropes had fallen away. Before her eyes he squirmed into the form of a serpent as long as she was tall, a lithe, dangerous-looking creature. For a second she froze, aware that he could strike at her easily within the close confines of the pit. But, of course, he had no fangs, thanks to Kalameshli. He could only threaten. She could sink her own claws into this reptile and rip him apart. Then he was lifting up his head, weaving up the pit's vertical side, and she waited for him to drop back down, and yet he never did, just ascending and ascending in a lazy zigzag, somehow clinging to the earth with the very scales of his belly, until his head had looped over the edge, and he was fully up. She realized that she was being left behind, and followed suit, scraping and raking herself up, with far more effort than he had shown. At the top, she thought she had lost him. Crouching low to the ground and relying on the cloud-coated sky to hide her in its shadow, she could see no sign of either snake or man. Then something moved almost under her feet, and he was there, lifting his arrow-shaped head, the forked tongue flicking. She had hidden a pack nearby, a hide bag of stolen food and clothes that she reckoned she could strap about her and carry either as wolf or tiger. Now she crept towards it, waiting to see if either of tonight's sentries was more alert, or whether they were still drinking to celebrate the successful testing. At her heels, the serpent followed. Unfanged or not, the thought made her shiver. And that concludes chapter number 6. So, very interesting. Accurate Stone River reveals his master plan to use Maniye to take over the Tiger Clan, the Shadow Eaters. But Maniye doesn't like that too much, and with good reason. She doesn't want to be a tool to be used, so she's taken off. her and Hesprick, the snake, are leaving. So we'll have to tune in again next week, Friday at noon, to see what happens. So I look forward to seeing you all then. And until then, enjoy your weekend. Bye now.